أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Uh, Jazakumullah khair everyone for having me. It's great to see everyone, and alhamdulillah, I'm really glad that I can actually see you. It makes a bit of a difference for me. And subhanallah, I just came from Denmark, and there was a similar weekend event over there, and I was supposed to come from there straight to you, but قدر الله ما شاء فعل. I was heading, now I flew back to Canada, and from Canada, I was going through the customs control. And before I actually even approached the passport office, like the officer, they came up to me and they just walked right up to me and said that, can we have your passport? And then they said that, do you know that you're not allowed in the US? And I said, what do you mean? They said, yeah, we received instructions from Washington directly to not allow you in. So I was very surprised, but I assume that it had to do with my my work. Obviously, the videos that we do about Palestine and talking about what's going on and so on and so forth, plus about the Khilafah and condemning the United States and capitalism and all the ideas that we carry. And it's a natural thing. Alhamdulillah, shukr, it's an honor, but of course we don't see it as anything special. Our deeds are only good if they're accepted by Allah Azza wa Jal. And may Allah Azza wa Jal forgive all of our shortcomings. Ameen Allahumma ameen. So today I want to talk about the topic of intellectual leadership. And instead of telling you why it's important, I'm just going to talk about it. And then hopefully by the time I'm done, you'll understand why it's important. It's a little bit of a complicated topic, but if you gain depth in it, you'll understand how the ummah is led. That's what has to be understood. We're trying to understand, how do we become people like independent thinkers, people who care about the ummah, people who care about the non-Muslims, people who care about small problems that surround us on an everyday basis. What drives us? Where does it come from? How can we be like the Sahaba who cared about these things? Why did they care about these things? Why did they care about the ahkam so much that the Sahaba, for example, there's an example of a Sahabi who was given responsibility to take care of the house of another Sahabi. You know, somebody says, water my plants and take care of my cat kind of thing. So a Sahabi had to go on a long trip, and he had asked another Sahabi, can you please take care of my house while I'm gone, to make sure it's kept well cared for and not kind of fall into ruin. If any problems happen, you can take care of it. So he would go every day and he would dust and, clean and take care of everything and then leave. And it would take him a short amount of time, maybe like an hour, maybe an hour and a half or so every day. And he would do it every day, take care, and he would go back. One day, a Sahabi was walking by and he saw him sitting in the blazing sun. Now we're talking about the sun of Mecca. I don't know if any of you, I think this was in Medina. Actually, I'm not sure, but either one, Mecca or Medina. I'm pretty sure it was in Mecca, but it was either Mecca or Medina, and so you know how hot it is out there in the middle of summer. So the narrator mentions that it was blazing heat, and the Sahabi was sitting in the blazing sun. And so as he walked past him, he said, "Why don't you just move over?" The shade was right there next to him. He said, "Why don't you move over and just sit in the shade?" And he said, "A'udhu billah, I seek refuge in Allah from gaining benefit from an amana, from a trust that was given to me." They were so careful independently. Their thinking was independent. They didn't have to have a policeman or a person coming, what's called the hay'ah, the department or the police of ordering the good and forbidding the munkar, going around hitting people with sticks and ordering them around. The question is the independence that Islam gives in the thinking for the masses, for the whole of society. What does Islam give to people that drives them to the point where they will not sit in the shade independently because they know how things work and they care about how things work? And this works for us on an individual level, as well as our families, our communities, and the world as a globe. And because we have to understand this as global thinkers, for this reason, I'll tell you right now. I'll give you another quick story. So a couple of months ago, there's a masjid not far from my house. It's the masjid that I usually go to. And the imam, of course, he and I don't see eye to eye. He believes in working within the political system. And I, of course, obviously reject the system entirely. And we want to work for the Khilafah. He accepts the call for the Khilafah, but he says that it's not time. He doesn't accept the way that we work for it. One of the things that had just happened the day before I had this meeting with him, he has these leadership programs. So he does a fantastic, like in terms of effort, a fantastic effort. He's the kind of imam that when you walk in the masjid, he's standing at the door. Isha, whatever salah, he'll be standing at the door, greeting everybody as they walk in. He's like, as you say, a man of the people. It's a good leadership quality to have. and he's established great leadership programs, if only they were better directed. But so the day before I had this meeting with him, I went to the masjid and I saw right before, I believe it was Maghrib or Isha, I can't remember, the youth that were there, they were all, and even children, they were writing letters to the MPs talking about how disappointed they are in their governance and their lack of condemnation for the Zionists they're doing, and so on. And they were all writing down the names of the MPs and so on. And these letters were actually put in letters and envelopes and all sent to the actual MPs. So the next day, I go to I have a meeting with the imam, and we're talking about what's going on and so on. And he tells me that, he doesn't want me coming to the masjid and discussing my views, which is that we should be at least also calling for why don't we write letters to the Muslim armies, right? Why don't we write letters to the embassies and the consulates of the Muslim lands, telling them that, like the military attaché and so on, and tell them that we condemn your lack of movement and so on and so forth. So he was telling me that his concern is that because he says that the parents of the children trust him and the environment that he's created. So he can't have somebody coming in and changing the topic and changing the tone. So he asked me, he said, look, if you were the imam of a masjid, a large masjid in the city, then why, or would you allow people to come in who disagree with you and to be discussing in your masjid? And a lot of us might think, no, if a person comes in, let's say if I was the imam and I was in charge and everyone listened to me and I was raising everyone and teaching everyone and constantly being there and building their thoughts and ideas. And then somebody comes and says that we should vote in the next elections. Would I allow that? Somebody comes in and says, you have to go and do this act of violence. Would I allow this? What if somebody comes in and says, we have to get elected into the governments of the Muslim lands and gradually work towards it? Would I allow this? And I remember I smiled at him and I told him, of course I would allow it. And so he was really surprised by the answer. And I told him the reason why is because when you build proper intellectual leadership, and we had already spoken at length, so he kind of understood this already. I told him that if you build proper Islamic leadership in people, they themselves will know how to respond. Basically, the joke was that if somebody came into the masjid and says, hey, we should vote and so on, the youth and whoever's there, if I had been there for some time and I've built them and so on, they would take the person, attach him to a mop head, and then go and mop the floor of the masjid with him, basically. So the thing is that because I would build them to the point where they understand the following points. They would have clarity, purity, and crystallization. There's these three terms that I want you to think about them. So when we talk about purity and clarity and crystallization, these are things that if we understand them, we'll have a very good idea of how to lead the ummah and how to lead ourselves. The meaning of purity, or rather, let's say clarity. Let's start with clarity. The meaning of clarity is the evidences for the things that you say. If I were to ask the imam of this masjid, what's the evidence in Islam that says that you can elect people or depend on people who reject Allah Azza wa Jal as legislator? Doesn't the Quran say, وَلَا تَرْكَنُوا إِلَى الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا, and do not incline or recline on those who are oppressors, and then you will be touched by the fire. And then Allah says, and you have no one who is your ally other than Allah, and then you will not succeed. So the thing is that what evidence do you have that says that we can vote for somebody to rule with other than what Allah has revealed? Of course, nobody has an evidence. There's nothing. It's just a logical thing. Well, if we don't, then what's going to happen is then they're going to win, or they're going to do whatever they want. There's no evidence for it. So that means they don't have clarity. Clarity is being able to see through the topic to your evidence. You know what the evidence is. You know what qala Allah, qala Rasul for every single thing that you say. The second thing, purity. You need to understand what is from other than Islam. You have to know what exists that could be influencing you. You have to understand it really well so that it can't influence you. You've purified your ideas and your actions and so on. And then the crystallization is that you understand exactly how to apply it. You can't have all these ideas and you don't know how to do it. You have to think about, how do I do it, and practice doing it if you can. Now, let's talk a little more about some real life kind of events. if you think about the vast majority of so-called Islamic governments that have ever risen, one of the primary reasons why they failed, aside from the fact that they may have been treacherous, like the Saudi government, they were established in order to control that land in the interests of the British. That's different. So there's traitors who have established governments. That's one thing. Let's just put those aside. We know they're traitors. But what about those who we can give them the benefit of the doubt? And they established an Islamic government and it collapsed. It failed. Why did the project fail? It's because of these 3 points. They didn't know evidences for the things that they did. So if they reach power, then what they would do is they would agree to nation state policies. They would agree to treaties that have no time limit, and they are with, for example, the Zionist occupiers. They would have currency systems that they would reaffirm the validity of. They would look for foreign loans and investments, which is all haram. So they didn't have the clarity. They did not know the evidences for what they were doing. They were just doing things because it made sense, because they were influenced. And this is the second point, which is purity. They were influenced by secularist ideas, which says that politics is all about just doing whatever it is that you can, just doing what makes sense, just what's logical, and even call politics the art of deception. You're just trying to trick people and play games and, figure out how you can get things done by just being smart, and rather than knowing your evidences, knowing what's from not just the laws that are from other than Islam, approaches, dishonest, manipulative approaches. Let's go and pretend that we're not working for an Islamic solution, and then we'll influence them, and then we'll achieve control of medical facilities and schools and change and influence and change public opinion through this deceptive way. This is what the capitalist system does. This is not what Islam does. Rasulullah ﷺ never laid that as an example. He never manipulated people when it came to when he came to identifying what his objective was. Now, in war, yes, even Rasulullah said war is deception. So in a specific war time where you're fighting a battle against somebody, then of course you don't give away your tactics. But when he was trying to change society, he was always very open and very clear. So we see the failure of government after government that claims or pretends to be Islamic because they don't have clarity, meaning that they don't have their evidences. They don't have purity, means that they're influenced by secularism, democracy, freedom, human rights, international law, all these sorts of ideas that are from other than Islam. And the third one is crystallization. They didn't know how to apply Islam. So when they go and reach power, they have no idea what to do. They don't know how to apply an economic system. They don't know how to build iman in people on a societal level. Now, what's the link between these two people? Because when these two examples, when I'm talking about talking to the imam, the idea that it kind of just dawned on me, the importance of this topic in that conversation, which is that if we as an ummah do not know, if we as Muslims who are carrying this call, we want Islam to lead the world, if we don't know how to get the Muslims in our community how to get them to become independent thinkers, how to get ourselves to become independent thinkers in terms of caring about the deen and knowing how to apply it and looking at problems and solving them according to Islam. If we can't do that on a community level, then what will happen is if we ever become responsible for doing it on a societal level, we'll be forced to just forcing people. Put out the police and make sure nobody commits haram, just like everyone, whenever they do it, this is all that they do. And parents do this at home. So it goes even down to the home level, where if we're looking at how we want to raise our children, for example, when you look at our family, we look at sometimes members of our family and they're not obeying Allah Azza wa Jal. How do you build that? How do you get your family to obey Allah Azza wa Jal without you always needing to be there? And if you disappear, well, then suddenly they're doing all this bad stuff or questionable things, or suddenly they start veering off. How do you create independent concern for a person's akhirah, and then a concern for how to apply it, and a concern for not being corrupted by external forces, and a concern for looking on the practical realities of how Islam should affect our lives and influence us? And so this goes to every level. It's the cause of the failure of iman in homes. It's the cause of failure of iman in groups. And it's the cause of failure of iman on a political level in states. It's because we're missing those 3 points. which are founded on the primary issue of the Aqidah of Islam. Now, when we talk about the Aqidah of Islam, we're not talking about the Aqidah that people talk about today, where they say it's about, is Allah above the throne, or is Allah Azza wa Jal on the throne, or is his hand literal? There's even a question by the Maturidiyya. They asked such a weird question. I remember I read it, and it was like the prime example to me of the most nonsensical aspect of ilm al-kalam. I'm not sure if any of you have looked into ilm al-kalam, but kalam is talking about unseen things based on logical, philosophical debates and discussions. And so one of the questions that the Maturidiyya ask is, if Allah Azza wa Jal's words are eternal, and Allah Azza wa Jal's speech is eternal, can his eternal speech be heard through the echoes of infinity backwards in time and forwards in time? And it's such a silly question because there's no way we can even begin to understand how to approach the topic, because it has nothing to do with anything that we can sense, and Allah Azza wa Jalla has not described it in Islam. So we're not talking about this philosophical jargon and all this stuff that people argue over and saying you have to have the correct aqidah by agreeing with my school of thought on aqidah, which is Allah's hand is literal, or somebody says, no, Allah's hand is figurative. That's not what we're not talking about these things. That's not really the aqidah, by the way. These are, issues that were raised due to Muslims being influenced by the thinking of Greek philosophers. This happened a long time ago. And to be honest, it's not even an issue today. If anybody comes to you and says, is Allah's hand literal? The answer you should ask him is, how is that even slightly important? And somebody can say, well, if you don't know your Lord, then you don't know Allah Azza wa Jal. And then the answer is, where does Islam tell me that I need to understand if it's literal or figurative? Where did one example, one hadith, the Prophet ﷺ or the Sahaba even talked once about whether or not it was literal or figurative? So if anybody brings these topics up, you tell them that this is all historical. It was a historical mistake by the ulama. We should have never discussed this in the first place. The only thing we do is we take what we need from it. And everything else, we're not saying it's one thing or another. We're just saying we're not going to get into it. All we say is, Yadullah fawqa aydihim, the hand of Allah is above their hands. It means Allah Azza wa Jal is with them, or the strength of Allah is with their strength, and so on. When you say wajh Allah, we're talking about the pleasure of Allah, the face of Allah, the pleasure of Allah. When we talk about al-khayr bayni yadayk, all good is in between Allah's hands. Again, it's a figure of speech that Allah Azza wa Jal controls all good, and so on and so forth. There's the kursi, and somebody says, well, why, or rather the arsh, there's the throne. Why even talk about the arsh? Well, the thing is that in our minds, it gives us an understanding of things such as when he talks about the kursi. The kursi is some ulama translate as a footstool or a small chair. And then there's the throne, which indicates وَسِعَ كُرْسِيهُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. His kursi, which is the smaller one, its authority spans all of the skies and the earth. Then it makes you think about how much greater is his authority outside of the skies and the earth with regards to his throne. Things like this. So you take the practical things that you can take from this, but we don't get into the nitty-gritty details of, is it literal? Does Allah literally have a hand? Astaghfirullah. We should never discuss these things. It's a transgression against Allah Azza wa Jal, and that's not what is meant by aqidah. What's meant by aqidah are the basic elements of why we are Muslim and whether or not we are Muslim. That's the aqidah. It's the question of the belief in Allah, and the belief in his books, and the belief in the angels, and the belief in the akhirah, and the prophets and messengers, and al-qada wal-qadar. So it's the basics of iman. That's the meaning of aqidah. Meaning, in more practical terms, I'll even give it to you, it means the question of, why are we here? Why are you alive? There's a small example I'll quickly give you. And for me, it's one of the most, I believe it's one of the most effective ways for me to think about. And this is, by the way, this is what I start with my children. And this is what I teach people who are up to 80 years old. Everybody can benefit from this example. Imagine right now, you're walking home, may Allah protect you. Some guys pull up in a van, put a bag over your head, throw you in the van, knock you out. Again, may Allah protect you. And you suddenly wake up a few days later, and you're in this massive warehouse. And in this warehouse, you can't see any way out. You wake up with other people too, but there's already other people there. So you're waking up and you see other people taking the bags off their head, and you take the bag off your head. And then you see all these people in the warehouse. And in this warehouse, there's everything you can imagine. There's some food, and there's people playing, and there's people building things, and there's even way back and behind you can see weapons, and you can see cameras, and you can see anything, everything you can think of is all there. This is a massive warehouse, and you don't know what's going on. What's the first thing you're going to ask? Why am I here? You might ask, where is this place? But that's not relevant. Even if they say it's on the moon, whatever, okay, that doesn't matter, it doesn't mean anything at all. The question you're going to ask yourself, because the reason why this is the most important question is because the answer changes everything you do in that place. For example, somebody says, we're here, suddenly somebody gives you a paper. On the paper says, you have 24 hours to get out of here. Otherwise, everyone's going to be gassed and killed. What's going to be the focus of your next 24 hours? Finding a way to get out. And if you see everyone's ignoring the paper and just playing and eating cake and having fun, you're going to say, are you people crazy? You have to get out of here. The whole point of them throwing us in here is seeing who can get out. If they said, your goal is to spend 24 hours here and not get mad even once. If you get mad, you're executed. We'll take you out and kill you. Then suddenly that becomes your purpose of existence there. All you're going to do is try to remain calm and just wait it out. And no matter who antagonizes you, you'll remain calm to the best of your ability. And so on. Every possible answer to this question of why am I here will determine what you're going to do in that warehouse. The same thing with life. And this is the aqidah. The aqidah is the answer of why we just woke up as little babies, screaming and crying. And then by the time we could think, many people didn't even teach us. And alhamdulillah, that we're Muslim, that's at some point somebody taught us. But nobody taught us to ask the question, why am I here? And you have all these choices and food and fun and so on. But if the purpose of your existence is to make certain choices, then your life is going to revolve around those choices. And that's the meaning of aqidah. The aqidah is the answer of what brought this universe into existence and what's going to happen to us after we die. But that is in itself is not enough, because we have to understand, how do we live according to this aqidah? And Islam gives us the halal, the haram, and the fard, and so on. The laws of Islam. So going back to what affected the Sahaba, the thing that affected the Sahaba in their lives is that they focused their life on this one particular question and answer, which is that, what put me on this earth? What purpose am I here for? And what are the consequences after I die? They were so focused on this one single point, and they lived according to the system that came from it, that it made them into very unique people. People with the Islamic intellectual leadership. Now, when I talk about having the purity and the clarity and so on, when we talk about the purity, I want to talk a little bit about, well, what's the alternative? So the Islamic answer about why we're here is that you're here to, Allah Azza wa Jalla created you. He gave you free will. He gave you laws that you have to follow. You can follow it or you can ignore it. Totally your choice. And on the Day of Judgment, I'll say mostly your choice. Allah Azza wa Jalla can help you along the way and sometimes even force you to become a better person, right? And that's from His mercy. So it's mostly your choice, and you, after you die, you're going to face Allah Azza wa Jalla, and He's going to account you for only that. Doesn't matter what you think, doesn't matter what you believe, that's what you're going to face. Now let's look at the alternative. Let's talk about the primary alternative. There's only one real major alternative in the world, aside from just simply like rejecting everything, but there's only one other system of belief that's the alternative, which is capitalism. Capitalism says, their aqidah says that Allah exists. They'll accept that God exists, no problem. But God cannot tell us what to do. We choose to obey Him in our private life, and He is forbidden from telling us what to do in public society. He can't tell us what to do. He's not allowed. You can't go to a government and say, God says so. No, you say, well, I as a Muslim feel this, or I as a Christian, or he as somebody as a Christian feels that, or him as whatever you feel. You can talk about how you personally feel as a human being in the system, but you're not, Allah Azza wa Jalla has no right to tell humans what to do in the capitalist system, because democracy says humans are the ones who say what we do. We're free. When you say free, by the way, are we free from all the laws? Can you drive without a seatbelt? Can you not pay your taxes? Can you go and take somebody's belongings? No, you're not free. You have to wear a certain amount of clothes. You have to act a certain way. You can't even deny the Holocaust. You can't do all these sorts of things. You're restricted in so many different ways. And so how is it possible that that can be called freedom? It's because it's not actual freedom from the law. It's freedom from God. You can do whatever you want. God doesn't tell you what to do. You're free from the church. You're free from the mosque. You can choose to go to the mosque, but the mosque cannot tell you what to do. And especially the mosque can't tell the government what to do. And that's the aqidah of the capitalist system. And that's the system of the capitalist system. So they have an aqidah and a way of life. And we have an aqidah and the way of life. So their aqidah, it's called secularism. And their way of life is called democracy. For us, we have the aqidah, which is La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. And the way of life is halal and haram. And so if you live your life knowing your evidences and knowing what's not Islam, and you know how to apply it, it makes you into a unique person. It gives you intellectual leadership. Now, going all the way back to the original point, which is when we talk about the societal issues of people, if we want to lead people by this intellectual leadership, what we have to build inside each and every one of us, ourselves first and foremost, and those around us on a societal level, everybody has to know, how do we know that Islam is true? Now, that's much too big a topic for today. But we have to know, how do we know that Allah Azza wa Jal exists? And how do we know that the Quran is from Allah Azza wa Jal? This is something that, of course, can be discussed with many brothers if you don't know the exact details. And then you have to ask, how do we determine what Allah Azza wa Jal wants from us? And it's not just in salah and fasting and so on. It's in everything, in terms of not only the individual actions, like how you dress and your akhlaq, your behavior, not swearing and being clean and using your right hand for clean things and left hand for dirty things, like going to the washroom and so on. But also for social things, interactions between male and female, interaction between let's say a son and their parents, or a daughter and their parents, brother and sister, Muslims towards each other, brotherhood, loyalty towards each other. So these are all social things, as well as things related to the economic things, whether it's when we look at currencies. This is something that everyone should practice. When you hold a $10 bill and a $50 bill and a $100 bill in your hand, why is the $10 bill worth 2 times as much as the 5? If you think about it, it's called a fiat currency. It's a currency. It's called let it be. That's what fiat generally means, which is let the value be what I say it is. Why is the $100 bill 10 times worth the 10? There's no reason at all. There's nothing in the bank that like people sometimes will say, well, there's gold. No, there's no gold. There's no platinum. There's no silver. There's no, peanuts. There's no shells. There's nothing. It's just a paper. And they can print it out, and they could not care less about, they care about some inflation issues and so on. But when you look at that, and I want you to do that, this is how you practice having the Islamic intellectual, how to follow the Islamic intellectual leadership. You hold the 100 and you hold the 10, and you ask yourself, why is this worth 10 times more? Allah Azza wa Jalla has forbidden this type of currency. And then you have to ask yourself, okay, so now I know I've purified myself of this solution that's not from Islam. How do I clarify to myself what is the Islamic solution? So you go to Islam and you find out the Islamic currency system is the gold and silver standard. That means that we Muslims in our system, we have gold and silver as currency, 4.25 grams for each dinar. And it's 11.7 something, or 11.125, I believe, something like that, grams of silver for the dirham. And that's our currency in Islam. That's what Allah has obligated, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it goes beyond that to so many other things. Business contracts, land laws. If a person owns a piece of land, he does nothing with it for 3 years, according to Islam, it must be taken from him. In the capitalist system, if you own it, you can do anything you want from it because you're free. You can oppress people. There's so much wealth imbalance because there's people who own massive amounts of land that they're just holding on to, and nobody's doing anything with it. Same thing with business contracts. When you look at stocks, you're buying and selling your partnership in a company, even though you have no right to do that because the other partners have not been consulted. So stocks are haram. Insurance. Basically, you have to pay all this money every single month, even though you might not want it, but you have to. And they make billions of profit from it. and you don't even know what you're getting. You're just paying money to them, and something may or may not come out of it. And the same for all the different solutions in the economic system. There's lots. It's a really big topic. The ruling system. When you look at how people are elected and how people are taken out of power and how people are accounted and how people are consulted and so on. Yes, there's a presidential system and there's a minister system, a parliament system where you have a prime minister and a bunch of ministers and so on and so forth. You have dictatorships and so on, but Islam has its own system where you have one emir. He's the final say in everything. Leadership in Islam is not collective. It's not a democracy. It's singular. In Islam, leadership, Rasulullah said, لا يكون لثلاثة أن يكونون بفلاة من الأرض إلا أن يؤمروا أحدهم. It is not permissible for any three people to be traveling anywhere on earth except one of them should be their emir. The ulama used to call the Khalifa al-Imam al-A'zam. The greatest of all the imams is the leader of all Muslims. There's only one. The Prophet ﷺ said, إِذَا بُيُعَ لِخَلِيفَتَيْنِ فَاقْتُلُوا الْآخَرَ مِنْهُمَا. If bay'ah was given to two khulafa, if Muslims end up with two rulers who rule with justice and good and they love everybody, not like these monsters that rule over us today, they're like two Abu Bakrs. You have to kill the second of the two, meaning you have to remove him from power, even if it meant killing him. He has to be brought down. Muslims are only allowed to have one single ruler because he is the successor, the Khalifa, successor, that's what that means, of the position of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Imagine somebody competing with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam for the position of leader. You can't have that. So that's where you have the purity, where you can see the other systems. They vote for a representative who has other representatives, and even in the presidential system in the United States, the president suffers so much from the inability to make decisions. If you go and read the memoirs of Obama or any of the previous presidents, one of the things they talk most about is how frustrating it was to get anything done. You have to fight for everything because it's not singular leadership. Now they might say, well, absolute power corrupts absolutely. This is completely false. Because when you're bound by the aqidah of Islam and you're bound by the guidance of Allah Azza wa Jal, it's not absolute power. It's singular leadership of the guidance of Allah Azza wa Jal. And there's this thing called shura, which, I want you to think about this carefully. A lot of Muslims say, well, the Islamic system is shura, just like democracy. That's why purity is so important. Because if you can't tell why democracy is kufr and why shura is completely different and Islamic, that means you don't have purity. You have corruption. So having clarity is knowing the evidences of shura, which a lot of them do. A lot of Muslims have that. Even those who are using it to falsely claim that democracy is the same as Islam. But the lack of purity is the problem, because they think that democracy and Islam are the same. Democracy says that we are the legislators. Shura says that if the Khalifa wants to seek the opinion of the people, there can be what's called a Shura Council. And he can go to them, and there's rules. There's certain times where if he asks them, he must abide by their decision. In other cases, he can listen to them and he can reject their opinion, say, no, I heard, but I don't like your opinion. I'm going to go with my original opinion. Which, by the way, is important. I don't know if any of you have ever been in such a situation. You go up to somebody and say, well, I don't know if I should buy these shoes or those shoes or this shirt and that shirt. And then what I usually do is I just pick one right away. Right? I'll say, I'll pick the blue one. And they're like, I don't know. I like the red one better. And because the way that you know what you actually wanted is by just picking something, and the person will fairly quickly know which one they actually wanted. And so sometimes the Khalifa will need to go to people and say, hey, what do you think I should do? Should we do this and should we do that? And he kind of is inclined towards one thing, but he needs some sort of brainstorming or whatever. And they'll say, let's do option A. And he says, you know what? Now that I think of it, no. Now I really think that the B is the right thing. In some cases, the Khalifa has the right to completely reject all forms of, even if the whole ummah votes in favor of one thing, and he says no, he has the right to say no. In some cases. And so these are the things that we have to recognize as Muslims on the process of how to go about looking into the Islamic intellectual leadership. And this goes for everything else. The last one I'll talk really quickly on, I think we're running out of time, but my excuse is that we started a little late, is the idea of foreign policy. When you look at these borders, having purity is recognizing that these borders, anywhere they are in the world, are the most nonsensical, absurd, corrupt, anti-Islamic system that the world probably has ever seen. It's the most ridiculous thing that people have actually, one of the most ridiculous things that people have actually invented in the history of mankind, and that people have accepted so wholeheartedly. It is it's one of the craziest things the more you think about it. I'm in Canada, you're in the US. In Canada, in the province that I'm in, so even in Canada, they cut it up with these little borders. In Canada, in Ontario, if you're over 18, you have the brain power to decide if you want to drink alcohol. If you go over to British Columbia, you're too dumb. You need one more year. If you fly back to Ontario, suddenly you're smart again. You fly back to British Columbia, you're stupid again. You can't. You're not allowed. You have to become 19. You fly to the United States, and I'm telling you, if you're right on the border and you go to Ontario, you're really dumb. You just literally go 15 minutes across the border into the US. You're now 3 years too dumb. You have to wait 3 more years to have any semblance of brain power capable of deciding whether or not alcohol is a good decision or a bad decision. And forget about marriage or so many other things. They might have different things across, different states, different provinces, but that's the thing. And then the other thing too is Canadians see themselves as completely different from Americans. And I say Americans like people from the United States of America, because the whole thing is North America. So Canadians are actually Americans. But anyway, that's a semantics issue. But that's the thing, is that Canadians and people from the United States, they're the same humans. People from one side of the border and the other side of the border, there's no difference. They're humans. If you look at Muslims, I remember there was actually I think it was an American or a British man who went to the Middle East and traveled throughout, and he came out and he said, I saw one of the most ridiculous things that I've ever seen. He went to Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria, and I think parts of Philistine. And he said, I went across all these different countries. They speak the same language. They eat the same food. And this was back in I think it was like the 70s or 80s. Like it was a while back before the Ummah has grown this much, because we've really grown a lot. And the Muslims are no longer really seeing these borders as relevant. But back then, he said they eat the same food. They have the same language. They look exactly the same. And they have the same religion, the same beliefs. And yet they're so divided, they won't even marry each other. They'll fight wars and kill each other. So who put these borders on us? This comes from the British after World War I. They flew into our lands. They drew these little lines on a map. And we, the fools of history, accepted them. When you see a Muslim from Pakistan, you see him as, oh, well, you're Pakistani. You see a Muslim from India, oh, you're Indian. Oh, you're Bangladeshi, right? Bengali or whatever. And me, Iraqi, and there's a Kuwaiti, and there's a Jordanian, as if what? As if we're different? But Mecca belongs to every Muslim, whether they're in Indonesia or India or Morocco or anywhere else. So these are the things that we have to recognize. To gain that purity, to reject everything. That's what purity means, by the way. That's truly the essence of what I'm saying here. Purity is to reject everything that comes from other than Islam. Every form of nationalism, every form of patriotism. We have no loyalty to any system, to any ruler, to any leader, to anything at all that's from other than Islam. The only thing we have loyalty to is what is based on clarity, which is knowing our evidence. We only have loyalty to the evidences. If the evidences say Khalifa, we say Khalifa. If the evidence say we're one ummah, we're one ummah. If the evidences say no division, division is the worst thing that we can possibly do. Everything that we do as Muslims has to be pure, meaning we know meaning we reject everything from other than Islam. Has to be clear, meaning that we know our evidences. And the crystallization point, this is something, it's maybe another topic, inshallah, maybe one day we can go over it, or something for you to think about, which is we have to practice, at least in our minds, how to apply it, what you do. Like I say, you look at the currency system, crystallization is by looking at the two currencies, figuring out what the correct thing is, and asking yourself, and maybe you can, and of course you do this over time. If I was responsible for bringing back the gold and silver standard, how would I do that? Even if you can't figure out the answer, practicing is how you train your mind to become crystallized, how to crystallize the application of the ahkam of Islam. That's another big topic, but it's something that all of us should aim and aspire to do so that we can, inshallah ta'ala, act as leadership for the ummah so that in the future, as we rise as an ummah, don't think that this is too big. It's not too big. As we rise as an ummah and we keep on practicing and thinking about these things, we gain experience and we gain depth and we gain capability. And inshallah, in time, Allah Azza wa Jalla will give us enough capability that when we come to implement it, inshallah, we all have a background at least. Some of us will be better, some of us will be practiced and will get much better as we see it applied, but we all practice these elements until we reach the goal of implementing Islam. I'm going to finish with one last example. I remember when I was, so I'm 45 years old. I'm an old man. And so when I first started carrying the da'wah, I was about 19, 20 years old. And I remember the examples that we used to give of Imam al-Shafi'i that used to just amaze me. Now it doesn't amaze me anymore. But back then it amazed me, which was the example of Imam al-Shafi'i when he was about 8 or 9 years old. He used to give fatwas. And when he would give a fatwa, I think he might even have been around 10 years old. But he would give a fatwa and he would say that he would give the fatwa and say that this applies to you and does not apply to me because I'm under the age of adulthood. He had such wisdom and depth. And I used to think that was amazing because I didn't know any kids who used to think like this. But today, the ummah has become so advanced that I see lots of children who think this way. I see lots of 7, 8, and 9-year-olds who know that the ahkam of Islam don't apply to them. They're responsible to pray salah. They're responsible to do good deeds. But they know that they're not sinful, but they gain good deeds if they do good deeds. But they're not sinful. But the more that they try to be good, the more Allah loves them anyways. So look how far the ummah has come. We've progressed as an ummah because we're all working on it. We're all practicing. So every single one of us has to work on establishing purity. You purify yourself from ideas that are not from Islam. You establish clarity. Know your evidences. Anything you do, check the evidence. At least just hear it. So you know that there's evidences for everything that you do. And everything that you see an election, think about how Islam would do this. You see traffic laws, think about how Islam would organize this. What laws of Islam leaves it open and what laws of Islam would restrict? Anything related to medical, organ donation, anything related to space travel, anything related to electric cars, anything related to sports. Ask yourself, what are the evidences for Islam? And what's the Western view, the capitalist view, and what's the Islamic view on the whole idea of such a waste of time, for example? Are sports just a waste of time? Are we allowed any form of entertainment? All these sorts of things, think about them. Gain that purity by removing the ideas that are not from Islam, and gain that clarity by knowing the correct Islamic viewpoint with the evidences of how to look at these things, and then practice with regards to the crystallization, which is knowing how to apply the solutions of Islam. Jazakumullah khair, and I'll leave it for, inshallah, any questions that you have in the upcoming section. So the first question says, I understand not voting, but in our Muslim lands, if an election is held between one who wants to attack Islamic institutions and one who won't, shouldn't we vote? The problem is understanding that going through difficulty is part of the test of Allah Azza wa Jal. We can't say, well, it's going to be difficult, such as Sumayya bint al-Khayyat is going to be killed, or Bilal radallahu anhuma will be put under a rock, or Muslims will be attacked in the street, or the Prophet ﷺ will have garbage thrown on him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And because of this, we can now do haram things. Because the first question is it halal or is it haram? And Allah Azza wa Jalla says, in reply to anybody who has any concern after that question, is I'm thinking of Makani Nabiyin, but that's the other ayah. It's Abdullah Rajim, Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. ما كان لمؤمن ولا مؤمنة إذا قضى الله ورسوله أمرا أن يكون لهم الخيارة من أمرهم. It is not permissible for anyone, believer, male or female, if Allah and His Prophet judge on a matter, meaning it's halal or haram, for them to have any choice in the matter. So, and I believe the ayah begins with وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ. So the first point is that we have to ask, is it halal or haram? And whenever I discuss this issue with people, and I've discussed it with scholars, imams, average people, like as you call them, like laymen, but just the average Muslim and so on. And the simplest way to understand it is this: if it's the question that we have to ask, and I'll even give you an example. There was an imam who was telling me, do not ever discuss this topic in the masjid. He was saying, I can't tell people that it's haram to vote. And he says that, of course, it's halal to vote and we have to do it, and it's even obligatory. But I said, okay, I just have a question for you then. I said, according to your knowledge of the Quran and Sunnah, what Islam teaches, is it permissible for a Muslim to choose somebody to rule with other than what Allah has revealed? And it was pretty funny, actually, because it seems like he didn't really get the question, that I'm asking a question about the topic. And he said, no, of course it's haram. And I remember I just stood there looking at him, waiting until like the light bulb turned on or something, like some electrical circuit connected. And he said, of course it's haram to, and then he stopped and he says, no, but this is different and there's necessity. And I said, you already know the answer, right? That's the thing. We already know the answer. Is it permissible to go to somebody and say, you reject Allah as a legislator and I'm choosing you to legislate laws in the place of Allah? That's what representative democracy is. He represents you. You choose him. He legislates on your behalf. Can I vote for a guy who's going to legislate kufr laws on my behalf? The answer is no, it's haram. So it doesn't matter what they're promising. If somebody's going to hurt us, maybe that'll drive us even harder to work to reestablish the Khilafah and solve the problems in our lands. Look at all the suffering Muslims face in Mecca. The Prophet ﷺ did not take measures to find compromises or anything like that with them, because Allah Azza wa Jalla did not allow it. And what it did is it drove Muslims even harder to stand firm on the deen and sacrifice for the sake of Allah Azza wa Jalla. So no, it's never acceptable to commit haram because of a benefit or because of some sort of comfort. The only time the ulama have said that it's permissible, the ulama, the classical scholars, not the modern day ones that don't base their opinions on evidences, but the classical scholars, when they talked about the excuses that we have, it's when there's actual torture, imminent death, like you're about to die, so you're so severely sick, so it's a very severe illness, to the point of you're going to be killed. Somebody's going to hold a gun to your head and says, drink alcohol, right? So you can only do things related to yourself, by the way. So he says, drink alcohol, then you're allowed to drink alcohol. It's good to say no and still sacrifice for the sake of Allah Azza wa Jal, but you can drink alcohol at that point in time. But if he holds a gun to your head and says, go kill that guy, you can't do that. You can't just do anything. Islam tells you what you can do in situations of what's called darura, necessity. So severe illness, imminent death, or torture. So under torture, like what happened with Ammar bin Yasir. Drawing a blank right now, subhanAllah. But yes, Ammar bin Yasir. Yes, Ammar bin Yasir. When he said negative things about Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he committed kufr in his words. And the Prophet ﷺ told him that if they came back and tortured you again, say the same thing again. Do it again, no problem. If you're being tortured, Islam excuses you as long as your heart is safe. So no, it is not permissible to choose the lesser of two evils because they're both haram, and the halal option is not voting. You reject the whole system. You say, I have nothing to do with this. I will not participate in your crimes or in your rejection of Allah Azza wa Jal. And anyways, you're all liars. And anyways, you're all manipulators. And you'll say whatever to my face, and you'll go behind my back and stab me in the back. If you watch the Canadian system, you'll see that it went from the conservatives, who are anti-Muslim, life, to the liberals, who are anti-Muslim morality. They want to spread homosexuality everywhere. You're not even allowed to question homosexuality in Canada anymore. It's a crime. So there's no lesser of two evils. There's just evil. Don't become a part of evil. The next question, a sister asks, are these three concepts, clarity, purity, and crystallization, meant to be worked on in that specific order, or an individual basis, or collectively as an ummah? They're not in any particular order. They're three separate things. Now, of course, you need clarity and purity before you can go to crystallization, right? You need to know your evidences. And if I can ask the brothers to keep the questions up until after I finish answering it, just because sometimes I want to refer back to the question to remind myself of these, of the point. Jazakumullah khair. They put it right back up. And so So yeah, they're basically separate things, and but as I said, clarity and purity should probably be done first, because then you know your evidences, you know what's not from Islam, and now you can think about how to apply it. As far as working on it as an individual or collective as an ummah, it's both. So we need to create individual purity and clarity, but also groups have to have purity and clarity, meaning that if, let's say, any group is working to bring about change in the Muslim lands or any sort of Islamic objective, and somebody doesn't have clarity, then they don't know their evidence. They don't have purity, they're mixing in some things that's not from Islam. They don't have crystallization, they don't know how to apply it according to Islam. So all these things are important, and especially on a state level, on a societal level, again, it'll work both as the state having to do this, but also create a public opinion that the ummah understands what is not from Islam and what are the evidences and how to apply it. But it's especially important for those working, but also it's worked on every level, individual, collective, as well. The next question is, with due respect, Islam has good lessons of leadership, but how come it fell apart in the first generation only? We witnessed civil war in 25 years of the Prophet ﷺ's demise. And so this is actually a really interesting thing if you think about it more carefully. When you read about the so-called collapse of the Khilafah, basically, which is not even close to a collapse, I'm going to give you a quick example about what happened in the US elections with Donald Trump, for example, right? Or George Bush, the clown, the younger one, the son. And so George Bush, everybody knows that there was some questionable details about the ballots. And with Trump, same thing. There were like electronic ballots, and Allahu A'lam what happened with that. So let's say we conclude with 100% certainty there was corruption in the way that it was that the elections happened, and let's say people were divided and they're fighting among each other. It doesn't change the fact that it's still the capitalist system. And it doesn't change the fact that everyone outside of the small number of people who are fighting for power lived their lives normally. It wasn't the whole United States was fighting and killing each other. Most people couldn't even care less about really what was going on. They just lived their lives in a secular democratic way. They had their secular democratic freedoms, and they were just living their lives. If you think carefully about what we're reading when we hear about what happened between Muawiyah and Ali or anything else later on, what we found, and even what happened with Uthman and the Khawarij and so on, radallahu an as-sahaba ajma'in, what we find is that it's a small number of events at the very top of ruling and control, but everyone else in society was just living their lives as Muslims. Everyday transactions and everyday eating and everyday family issues and everyday everything. People were completely living Islamic lives. So no, the Khilafah did not fall apart. The Khilafah remained completely Islamic, and life was completely Islamic all the way until the fall of the Khilafah in 1924. Problems that happened in terms of how the rulers were given bay'ah or whatever might happen in conflict between two different groups, like even the so-called civil war that happened between Ali's side, radallahu anhu, and Muawiyah, and all the Sahaba, radallahu anhu, who were on that side, that conflict was not actually, I mean, if you were to go into some people's intentions, you might say that it's a conflict for power. But what it was, Ali was saying that I am now the Khalifa. You have to fall in line with my choice to not go after the killers of Uthman. And Muawiyah was saying, no, we must go get the killers of Uthman first. So it wasn't a struggle for power. If you look at it on its surface, it wasn't corruption or the end of the Khilafah. No, the Khilafah still existed, and everyone still lived Islamic lives. But there was a struggle over a decision. People were so upset about the unjust murder of Uthman that they ended up fighting each other. And by the way, there's even narrations that talk about they had decided not to fight, but there were some corrupt people among both ranks, and they went to each side, and they went intentionally. They went to, like, they're from the same Khawarij who were on. They went to both sides, and they went to the other side and killed some people from each side. I think it was one or two from each side. And when people woke up, they saw that people were killed, and now Ali could no longer stop. He was telling people, stop, don't fight. And even the Muslims on the other side were yelling out, stop, don't fight. But because some corrupt people started the fight, they ended up killing each other. But that does not mean that the Khilafah fell or failed in any way, shape, or form. And the proof of this is you see the Khilafah lasting for 1,340 something years after that. No state has ever lasted this long. Like you see the United States, how long has it been in existence? And it's barely standing. because of how the economy is crumbling and there's so much distrust and there's so much division. And so, and really the economy is in shambles. The military is in shambles. And this goes the same across Europe. The West is falling apart already. And it's only been a couple of hundred years. Well, a few hundred years, maybe 300-400 years, if you want to look that far. And so the Khilafah existed for 1,340 something years. It was always Islamic. And the way that you know this, by the way, and since I can see there's quite a few questions, but I'll make the later answers a little more brief. But how do you know that it was always Islamic? Go look at the remnants of all the buildings and all the art and all the books that existed prior to the fall of the Khilafah in 1924. Do you see anything that resembles what you see today of all the haram and the sin and the debauchery and the immorality and the sickness that exists in these societies? The buildings were built on the concepts of Islam. The homes were built on the concept of, like even right now, you go to most of the Muslim lands, you find this concept of the privacy of the home. You don't find big, huge windows that people can see into your bedroom and into your bathroom. You don't see these sorts of things over there. You see the remnants of an Islamic lifestyle. And the books, you see all these books. You won't find a single book from the beginning of Islam until the year 1800, not a single book written about a law system other than Islam. Not one Muslim, scholar or otherwise, has ever written a book, and this is an amazing thing to actually look into. Nobody even considered the even slight acceptability of a foreign legal system. They debated Greek philosophy and the nature of Allah Azza wa Jal and al-Qada wal-Qadar and everything. They never once accepted the possibility of a legal system other than the Quran and Sunnah. So you want to talk about was it an Islamic system? You won't even find even a discussion about another system. Democracy existed before Isa alayhi salam was born. And yet, not one book existed in the Muslim Ummah to talk about this, to discuss democracy or any sort of ideas about man-made law. Next question. A brother in the audience asks, what can I look at as a practical reference? Oh, wait, somebody just beat that question. Mu'adh asked the question. I'll get to the next question afterwards. Mu'adh asks, you said necessary is death, torture, severe illness. What do you say to scholars that say that necessity is much more than that, like mortgage, etc.? So we just have to be a little bit careful about just because somebody. So just to kind of keep this question a little bit simple. In Islam, there is a difference between a person who's a scholar and a person who's a mujtahid. Okay, mujtahid is a specific classification of a person who has the technical capability of looking into the Quran and Sunnah, ijma', sahaba, and qiyas, and figuring out the law of Allah Azza wa Jal in the evidences. A speaker, a scholar, a faqih, a storyteller, some sheikh with a cute little beard and a whole bunch of videos who can tell beautiful stories. They are not mujtahideen. Okay, may Allah reward them immensely. I mean, some of them, I love listening to them when they tell stories. But as soon as they start giving fatwas, I change the channel, or I just simply get annoyed and I start writing notes on how I'm going to respond. Because they are not mujtahideen. They are not qualified to speak on behalf of Allah Azza wa Jal. Only a mujtahid is qualified to say Allah, this is, because remember, when you give a halal and haram fatwa, you're saying Allah, the creator of the universe, has allowed this. The Prophet ﷺ said, those who are most daring in giving fatwas are the most daring of throwing themselves into the hellfire. So we have to be very careful in identifying, well, okay, let's say Sheikh XYZ gives a fatwa that it's permissible to get a mortgage on your first house. Who are you? Are you a mujtahid? No. Okay, he's not a mujtahid. Where did you get this fatwa from? One time I was sitting in the masjid and they were telling me you can't tell people that you can't vote. And I said, okay. So they said, why? And they said, because you don't have a mujtahid. I said, I'm following the ijtihad of Sheikh Taqiyuddin and Abdul Qayyim Zallum, rahmatullah alayhim, and other scholars, Ahmad al-Da'ur and others, rahmatullah alayhim ajma'in. And so they said, and then I told them, hold on a second. Who's your mufti? Were you going on the minbar every single day saying vote, vote, vote? Who's your mujtahid that says that it's permissible to vote? And all of them, subhanAllah, there's a whole room of them trying to shut me up. They all just stopped. I remember it was weird, like minutes were passing and it was just dead silent. They don't even know their own mujtahideen because most people don't have mujtahideen. These so-called fatwas are not shar'i fatwas, they're logical fatwas. They're benefit and harm fatwas. How do you think people, when you go to the Senate or when you go to the parliament over here and they're trying to figure out what's allowed and not allowed, what do you think the process that they use is to figure out what's right and wrong? They just decide what's harmful, what's beneficial, what's most beneficial, let's go with that. What's least harmful, let's go with that. Didn't we talk about purity? Having purity is knowing that and rejecting it and saying only Islam. And Islam does not say you use products at all. When Allah forbade alcohol, what did he say? He said, in it is much harm. And I'll give you a better example about riba. Actually, on the example of riba with a mortgage, Allah says, and they say that riba is like business. It's like trade. You buy something, you sell it at a profit. You take money and you trade it at a profit. And Allah doesn't respond by saying, but mortgages are harmful and mortgages are, riba is harmful and it leads to imbalance of wealth in society. What does the ayah in the Quran say in response? وَأَحَلَّ اللَّهَ الْبَيْعَ. And Allah has made trade halal and He has made riba haram. That's all. So the type of thinking that we have as Muslims is Allah has allowed this and forbidden this, and that's the end of the conversation. It doesn't matter if there's harms or benefits. We don't care about the harms or benefits. If Allah has forbidden it, then it's harmful to us even if we don't see it. وَعَسَىٰ أَن تَكْرَهُ شَيْئًا وَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ. Maybe that you hate something, you despise something, you think it's horrible, but it's good for you. And it may be that you love something, you think it's great, first house, mortgage, but it's bad for you. And Allah knows and you don't know. وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ وَأَنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. So Allah tells us that you're not allowed to discuss this. مَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ وَلَا مُؤْمِنَةٍ. It's not for a believer, male or female, if Allah and His Messenger have dictated something in a law, for them to have any say in the matter. So when it comes to these sorts of things, first of all, it has to be a mujtahid, and it has to be on an ijtihad, which is Quran and Sunnah, not some benefit and harm saying, well, if we don't, then I'm going to be paying all this rent. Pay all the rent. Buy your Jannah. Buy your house in Jannah by paying this rent and not getting a mortgage. What's the problem with that? Rabih al-bay'a. What kind of a great business deal is this? I will happily pay thousands of dollars every single month and just burn my money. And then I go on Yawm al-Qiyamah and Allah honors me with a palace in Jannah 10 times the size of the planet Earth because I sacrificed my home in the dunya. That's it. It's worth it. It's worth the exchange. So this logic doesn't work. And so we should not accept this. And as I said, if there is a valid ijtihad, then we can consider it. But I've been studying this for a long time. I've looked at Yusuf al-Qaradawi's fatwa. I've looked at the fatwa in my local, there's a Canadian Council of Imams. They've given out a completely baseless fatwa saying you can get your first house on a mortgage. And brothers have come to me crying after getting their first house. And saying, after I got the house, I realized that the fatwa was wrong because I was just so greedy in getting the house. It's like they open the door for this fitna. And then after people satiate that greed for the house, they realize, subhanAllah, what have I done? I have a riba mortgage right now. One brother was crying. And so he got out of it, alhamdulillah, very quickly. But that's the thing, is that these lead to disasters in people's deen. So we got to be careful of who we take our fatwas from. I'm going to go to the next question, just the one that I was talking about before, even though it's not as many thumbs up as the other one. But brother asks, what can I look at as a practical reference, as an example of the intellectual leadership of Islam when the Muslims world today is in ruins? So that's a tricky question. I'm not exactly sure what you mean, but basically the idea is that when you look at the society that you're living in, I'll give you maybe a practical example. It's hard to think of practical examples because we don't live in a world that has almost any of these examples, but I'll give you a few. If you look at the example of the speeding tickets, speeding laws. So when I drive, okay, I may or may not break the speed limit a lot. So if the speed limit is 100, I may or may not be driving about 145, 150 kilometers an hour, as long as I don't get caught. Now, if I'm driving in Dubai or Abu Dhabi, then of course I follow the laws because there's cameras everywhere. But where there's no cameras, I may or may not speed. The problem is because what's the incentive for me to not speed? The incentive is basically driving within what I believe is safe. Now, and the problem in this system, if I don't get caught, I basically didn't commit a crime, although I don't really accept the system as a whole, but I do believe we have to drive within what's safe. Most people should not drive very fast. Some people can. Some people are trained. Some people are very good at driving. Then I would say they definitely can drive, I'm not suggesting it, but if I heard of a brother saying it, I wouldn't be too upset with him. But if I heard of somebody who's a new driver driving 150, I would get very upset with them because then it's dangerous. But in an Islamic system, if we're living in the Khilafah and the Khalifa says the recommended speed limit is 120, the absolute maximum that you're allowed to go is 140. It means if you go 141, you're committing haram. So now when you're driving on the highway, not only are you going to stay under 140 because you don't want to be committing haram and you want good deeds, you get good deeds for going the speed limit now. If some guy flies past you, there's only two things that you can do. Give him an excuse that he's really got to go somewhere. Emergency, I don't want to say, diarrhea or something like that, but that's a joke that we usually make in the car. But the thing is, somebody goes flying by really, really fast. You make an excuse, it's a serious emergency, or he's a fasiq. He's a sinner, he's committing haram. Basically, that's how you establish. Now, because what guides people in society, it's not the fear of police. It's not the fear of getting caught. Allah Azza wa Jalla caught you before you even thought of committing the crime. You're caught instantly before it even happened. So just don't do it. These are the kinds of examples of the Islamic intellectual leadership. It gives you that leadership in your own mind. It leads you without needing to be led. How many Muslims do you know obey Allah Azza wa Jalla in private? And I hope all of you obey Allah Azza wa Jalla in private. Let's say even not perfectly. But there's so many things that all of you do that nobody knows except for Allah Azza wa Jalla. Why do you do it? Because you have the Islamic intellectual leadership leading you. Your aqeedah, your evidences, your love for Allah Azza wa Jalla, your knowledge how to implement it. These are the things that are examples. Now, there's lots of other examples, but I hope that kind of gives you a bit of an idea of the direction. Somebody asked, you mentioned that conservatives go against Muslim life. How so? Basically, all man-made law goes against Muslim life. Conservatives are simply people who have a certain set of policies based on man-made law, and it's man-made ideas, it's man-made direction. It's all, and whether it's them, the Republicans over here, liberals, or whoever else you might have, basically, they are all based on the same basic foundation, which is the aqeedah of secularism, which says that God doesn't tell us what to do for law. We tell ourselves what to do for law, and the ideas of democracy and freedom, which is that humans are the legislators and that we're free. We have the four freedoms: personal freedom, freedom of belief, freedom of expression, and freedom of ownership. And the freedom of ownership is what rules the land. So conservatives are just another form of man-made law. So you're either going to choose man-made law that is a little more conservative towards Christian beliefs, or you're going to have man-made law that's a little more liberal towards atheist beliefs, right? Or you might have the difference between Democrats and Republicans and so on. The dichotomy and the differences might change across the circle of like in Canada, it's more like Christian versus atheist. Whereas with the Republicans and the Democrats, it's a bit different. It's more like Democrats focus on internal issues and Republicans focus on external issues. And everybody has their own kind of approach and direction, but it's all man-made law. So if you choose them, you're abandoning Allah Azza wa Jalla. And if you seek help from them or you depend on them, then Allah Azza wa Jalla has already warned you. Do not depend on them. Do not incline towards them or recline on them. And I saw a hand put up. I'll try to figure out what that means in a second. But the ayah says, and do not incline or recline onto them or rely on them, then you'll be burnt by the fire. And you have no ally other than Allah. So they're not your allies. Allah is your ally. And you will never be given victory if you did this. So we should not seek assistance from oppressors, which are the people who rule by man-made law. So what's this hand up?
Sheikh, I think you might have accidentally clicked. It says you raised your hand.
Oh, I didn't click anything, but I accept that it was my fault. All right. So I raised my hand out because I need to finish what I was going to say, I guess. All right. So the next question is, how can we purify our concept? Now I'm going to try to go through the questions. Oh, actually, these ones. Okay. So I'm going to try to answer the questions much more quickly. How much time do we have left?
I'm being signaled last question, Sheikh.
Oh, really? Okay. All right. So let me look through the questions and see which one is the. today? Whereas practice and implementation, especially khilaf practice today, how do we put it for public as rolling with your hand? Okay, allow me 2, if that's okay.
Yes. Sure, you got thumbs up, Sheikh.
All right, Jazakallah. So one question asks, how do you see the concept of khuruj, rebellion against the ruler, in the present reality with your hadith that you presented? So the concept of there's khuruj and khawarij. That's the first distinction you got to make. Khuruj is a term referring to a specific type of action. Khawarij is a classification of a group of people. The Khawarij are people the Prophet ﷺ spoke about specifically, and they are people who they will not really be believers. They will have hostility towards the believers. They will be soft on the disbelievers. They will see the believers' blood as halal, meaning that they see that any Muslim can be killed. They are the dogs of hell. They have very shallow iman, and there's other things about them that fighting them is permissible, and so on and so forth. So the Khawarij are a certain classification of people. If anyone says, "Oh, you're rebelling against the ruler," or you question the ruler, that makes you a Khawarij, no, that's a fool who doesn't understand the meaning of the difference between Khuruj and Khawarij. Khuruj, it means to leave, linguistically, right? So if you do Khuruj on a ruler, it means you will leave obedience to that ruler. Now there is permissible Khuruj and impermissible Khuruj. There's permissible Khuruj, such as Khuruj on the rulers today. They have no legitimacy. None of the rulers of the Muslim lands, or the West, of course, but let's talk about the Muslim lands. None of the rulers in the Muslim lands have any legitimacy according to Islam. And therefore, they have no rights that Islam gives the rulers. And so you can reject them. If you want to call that Khuruj, linguistically, yes, it's Khuruj. But because it means Khuruj min ta'a, to leave obedience to that ruler. So yes, we reject them. We reject their laws. We reject their way of life. We reject their legitimacy and their status and everything that they stand on. So that's linguistically khuruj. But if somebody were to say that makes you khawarij, no, this is a fool who doesn't understand that Prophet ﷺ talked about the khawarij. He didn't describe them as people who are going to rebel against the rulers. If you think about the hadith about khawarij, it doesn't describe them as those who reject the rulers. It described them in a specific way. And like as I mentioned, the Quran will not go beyond their throats. They'll enter and exit the deen like an arrow, entering and exiting a hunted animal, what they call game, like a deer, for example. So there's a description for them. Now, the reason why people used to use that about the Khawarij back in the time they started around the time of Uthman, radiallahu anh, is because one of their early manifestations was accusing the Khalifa and some of those around him of kufr. And they would say, they had all the signs of the Khawarij, and they would be attacking Uthman. So there was a congruency between them attacking the rulers. But that doesn't mean that anybody who does khuruj is one of the Khawarij. For example, what happened with, I don't know if you heard that story of Sa'id ibn Jubair. There's a famous story of him and what happened between him and Al-Hajjaj, the governor of Iraq. And in the end, Al-Hajjaj kills Abdullah ibn Sa'id ibn Jubair. And Sa'id ibn Jubair was one of the great scholars of our history. He was one of the greatest scholars of our ummah. And so the thing is that the reason why Al-Hajjaj killed him was because Sa'id ibn Jubair rebelled against him and tried to take him out of power. Him and a number of scholars agreed on a fatwa that Al-Hajjaj had committed kufr and that it was permissible to rebel against him and remove him from power. They lost. Nobody has ever called them Khawarij, because back then they were not fools. They understood the difference between Khawarij and Khuruj. Rebelling against the ruler is one thing, and being a Khawarij is completely different. Now, rebelling against the ruler, as I said, is permissible when Islam says that they have no legitimacy, or if Islam says you have to fight the ruler, like I said, if there's two khulafa, you have to remove the second of the two. You're not Khawarij because you're removing the second of the two. The Prophet ﷺ says rebel against the second of the two. And that's why, I hope that gives a better understanding of this topic. And the last question that I'll answer is, how can we purify our concepts when living anywhere on earth today? The ideas of individualism, capitalism, nationalism has been so ingrained that we don't realize basically how much it's affecting us and so on. So, and in linking to that, I believe these two questions are linked, which is crystallization requires practice and practical implementation, even before and especially before the Khilafah is here. So how can we practice this today? So this is what I do. And this is what I recommend everyone does this. The way that you can constantly identify what is impure and how to gain that clarity, this is what I recommend you do. What I kind of do is I make kind of like an overlay. When I'm walking around every day, does someone want to say something?
I apologize to interrupt, but if there's any way that you can, we have a guest that has something later, so if you can just try to summarize it. I apologize for saying that, but if you can.
Sorry. Okay, no problem. I'll end and I'll give it 1 minute, inshallah. I didn't realize I'm cutting into someone else's time. I thought that I was one of the last speakers.
No problem. Jazakallah.
Yeah. Barakallah bik. So basically what you should do is, as you're living your daily life, everything you do, you got to practice. You start with some things, maybe 1 or 2 things, but if you can, everything in your life, as you live your daily life, look at every action that you do and every action that other people do, anything that you watch, anything that you listen to. Ask yourself, what viewpoint is this based on? Why are people doing this? What's the Islamic viewpoint? And what's the non-Muslim viewpoint? And try to always create that contrast in your mind, knowing what the Islamic view is and knowing what the un-Islamic view is, and then asking yourself, if the Islamic view is not being applied, or if the Islamic law is not being applied, how would I solve this? How would I solve healthcare problems according to Islam? How would we solve these problems in society? If we saw not enough Muslims are memorizing the Quran, or we don't have enough mujtahideen, and so on and so forth, how would I work on, if I had a lot of Muslims working with me, how would we work on bringing back these laws and applying them in the Muslim lands? How would we remove the borders? How would we fix all these problems that we're facing? Practice doing this. It may seem like a big thing now, but the more you do it, the more you'll be able to, inshallah ta'ala, become good at it, and it becomes a part of the way you think. So for me, I've done it so much that now when I live my life, it's kind of involuntary. I'm always analyzing these things, and I hope that all of you can practice this, inshallah ta'ala, and that way you gain crystallization, inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan. I really do apologize for taking too much time, and subhanakallah bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.